Gabby Petito, Part 15.3, Laundrie Dead. A further key question to address with regard to the recent news that the remains of Brian Laundrie have been found is, how did he die? The news report indicates that a skull and some bones have been found, and by talk of remains, it's clear that it wasn't a body newly dead, but one that either decomposed or had suffered the ravages of the environment within which it had been found, so that much of the skin and flesh had perished, perhaps been eaten away. There are three options, of course, when it comes to understanding how did he die, and it may be that any forensic analysis, given all that was found, means that it's too difficult to ascertain that. It remains to be seen what further information is provided. The first question is, did Brian Laundrie commit suicide? Narcissists do commit suicide, but it is rare. It happens as a consequence of either a fuel crisis or comorbid conditions. And I explain in detail about this situation in my video, The Narcissist and Suicide, and I'd invite you to listen to that. It isn't necessary for me to go into the detail of the mindset of the narcissist with regard to why narcissists do and don't commit suicide. You can get all of that information from the video that I've just mentioned. But it's my view that he did not commit suicide. The reason being is that whilst he was suffering diminished fuel levels, he was not yet in a position of fuel crisis. I believe that Brian Laundrie was having more contact with people than might have been imagined, and I believe that there were individuals that were keeping him appraised of certain goings-on, which would provide him with fuel. He also thought that he was clever, evading the law. And, although he was a coward, he would have derived fuel from thinking about the fact that he was managing to stay away from law enforcement. That his narcissism would have told him that he was winning, that he was superior to them, that he had the skill set to be able to outwit all of the law enforcement that was searching for him. That he had placed himself in a situation which was akin to being in the wilderness, an area that was very difficult to search, believing that he, of course, couldn't be found. His narcissism would have been directing him on an ad hoc basis, basically getting through moment after moment, with overall, he would be looking to stay away until such time as an opportunity presented to remove himself, no doubt from the United States. But unfortunately for him, he didn't have the skill set or the resources to achieve that quickly, and his demise occurred before any alternative plan could be addressed to achieve that. Laundrie thought that he was some kind of survivalist expert. He'd been on hikes in the wilderness. He felt that he knew something of that. He believed that he was somebody that could survive on his own, driven by his cocky arrogance that is part of his narcissism. Furthermore, of course, why would you bother disappearing and hiding only to then kill yourself? Of course, that might happen if he'd entered a fuel crisis, but as I've explained, I don't see that that had occurred, and instead, there was no point in him going to the lengths of staying out of the way, the withdrawal, which allows him to assert control, and therefore he felt largely in control. Remember, he doesn't think in terms of control, but his narcissism does on his behalf, and the threat to control manifests as fear, anxiety, fury, etc. And Laundrie, having removed himself, would of course read reports that he was being searched for, but because he won't have necessarily seen anybody in the vicinity where he was, the immediate threat to control will have been nullified. He will have congratulated himself on getting himself into this position of hiding, not being seen, lying low, and finding it almost amusing that he'd managed to outwit, as he saw it, law enforcement. He would have still, of course, been receiving fuel, and whilst his fuel levels would have been diminished, I don't see that he would have been in a crisis position. And his own narcissism wouldn't want him to commit suicide. Where it does, that is the act of ultimate last control. I'm taking my life, so you can't lock me up, you can't shoot me, you can't threaten my control any longer. But Brian Laundrie wasn't at that point. Driven by his warped perception of the world through his particular brand of narcissism, he actually believed that he was winning, that he was getting away with it, and that he would get away with it. I believe that he was receiving assistance, which will have continued to give him the impression that he would succeed and win. He had been undetected for some considerable period of time, and again, that would have bolstered his cockiness of believing that he would stay undetected and uncaught, and thus unconsciously remaining in control. And therefore, the parameters that would ordinarily apply to a narcissist with regard to suicide were not applicable, and therefore I don't believe that is what has happened. Might it have been that Brian Laundrie was murdered by somebody else? It is, of course, a hypothesis that ought to be addressed, but it doesn't appear that ultimately there is any logical basis for that having occurred. There is no information to suggest that there would be somebody that was intent upon murdering him. Yes, of course, there were many people very angry at the belief that he had murdered Gabby Petito, and of course mob justice might have prevailed if people had got their hands on him, but more likely the individuals that would get to him first would be law enforcement, who would not kill him unless they were forced to do so through lethal force, or individuals would want him to face the full rigour of a trial and all, of course, the publicity and getting the answers as to what has happened. And therefore, I don't see that there was anybody with a particularly strong motive to want to find him and kill him. If anybody was to find him, they were more likely to want to bring him to justice, with all the attendant provision of answers and accolade that would come with that. What does this then leave us with? Well, it leaves us with the fact that basically Brian Laundrie perished as a consequence of environmental factors. Perhaps dehydration, hunger, or the peril of the environment that he found himself in. That he might have fallen, hit his head and drowned, that he might have got hypothermia, that he might have been bitten by a snake, that he might have been eaten by an alligator, or a combination of all of those things, as he sought to stay out of the reach of law enforcement. And if to the extent that he was suffering lowered fuel levels, if not a fuel crisis, this would have impacted upon decision-making, causing him to become more reckless. And I think that ultimately, Brian Laundrie died as a consequence of his narcissism taking him into the third assertion of control, the collateral consequence thereafter being of diminished fuel levels. This resulted in bad decision-making, him staying in a position of withdrawal, and ultimately, his own arrogance and delusion that he could remain hidden and stay away from law enforcement caused him to remain in this position of withdrawal. But it was his undoing, because he didn't have the natural ability and talent to survive in that environment, and it was the environment that overcame him. Based on the information as it stands at this juncture, it's my view that driven by his narcissism to assert control by forcing him into the third assertion of control, making him in effect flee and seek to stay hidden, the receipt of fuel continued but at a diminished level, and that he believed that he could evade capture, and he believed that he would be able to survive in that environment, but his own deluded view meant that actually he was not able to, and it was the fact that he succumbed to the environment. And that is how he met his demise, and that is why only remains were found rather than a corpse. I'd be interested to learn of your views and observations, as always, in the comments. Please do share them. I find it interesting to see what your theories, observations are, your reactions to what I've explained to you. Do ensure that you like the videos and share them. I'm HG Tudor. Thank you for listening.